We historically had thought in this mechanistic tool-based idea of people, process, and technology. And so the technology being the lead if you're in certain consultancies, process maybe a close second, and then people need to adapt to the technology and or process. I added place in there because I was starting to see that place had a substantial impact on whether change occurred in a meaningful way, whether it was sustained, and the pace at which that change could take place.
Hello and welcome to a new episode of the Days of Change podcast. My guest today is Douglas Gilbert, who is both an academic and a practitioner in the field of change. With him, I will be talking on organizational leadership and culture, and in particular on the role of space as an important element of any transformation process. And we might branch out into the question of how the neuroscientific discoveries of the last decade impact our thinking on leadership and change. I'm Holger Nauheimer, your host, and if you want to listen to other episodes of this podcast, please go to our website, which is changedays.com/podcast. In our show, we cover all aspects of change, from personal development to large-scale organizational change, and also we try to find out who are the people who drive change, what made them choose their profession, what challenges did they discover along the way, where did they struggle and where did they succeed to follow the path that they had chosen, or whether the path chose them. I'm really excited about today's episode because Gilbert, we discussed that before, so we agreed on Gilbert, can look back to 30 years of experience in companies and in different positions as a researcher and teacher. He had different positions. For example, he was the dean of the School of Organizational Leadership at the University of the Rockies in Denver, Colorado. He worked before, and we talk about that, for the pharmaceutical industry in Europe, and he was a member of large consulting firms. He has a broad, or shall I say, comprehensive view on change, and he has been sharing his insight at different schools around the world, at exotic places like Mongolia and Switzerland and somewhere else. We'll find out. Doug joins us today from Vilnius, Lithuania, where he's on a 6 weeks teaching term, and he will be one of the facilitators in the upcoming Berlin Change Days, end of this month. We're going to talk about that also towards the end of this show. A very warm welcome to you, Doug. It is always good talking to you, and we haven't done that for a while.
That's very true, Holger, and it's always energizing and I think wonderful to have a conversation with you. And I look forward every year to Berlin Change Days as one of the highlights of the year, and returning to Berlin. I can't remember how many years I've come, but I do remember that my first indication that there was a Change Days was shortly before you had the first one, which you had a very short amount of notice. And I wished I could have come, but then I came the next year. And I come away from every event with several key learnings that I invariably use in the work that I'm doing.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Doug. And maybe we can broaden that a little bit later, and towards the end we can talk about what you're actually going to talk about this year. But I would like to start with asking you a question. How would you describe yourself as a person, not as a professional, in a few words? Who's the persona behind the official profile, the official Doug Gilbert? I'm getting mixed with your name now myself. We shouldn't have talked about it. So behind the official Doug, what drives you as a human being?
I think curiosity for learning and building relationships with people. Several years ago, we went through one of my positions, the Strength Finders approach that's offered as one of the management development approaches, and I've taught that as well. And I came out with 5 very similar things in that profile, and they were all about building relationships, being curious about what changes, what is in culture, things like that. And I think that has been throughout my life and career a driving force that has really carried me to far corners of the globe and a large number of different types of situations.
Yeah, and I think as change consultant, as change practitioner, you can't drive without curiosity. It's quite funny because in the last podcast with Simone Sloan, we also talked about the same topic. And as I know, you know German quite a bit, there's this word Neugier in German, which I really like, which I translate into lust for news, which obviously we both have.
Correct.
Let's cover a bit of your life. Actually, I don't know, where were you born and how did you grow up?
Well, for someone from Germany, this is always an interesting story. I was born in the United States, in the state of Nebraska, but I was born into an immigrant family. And the immigrant family is an interesting story that I probably have never related to anybody at Berlin Change Days. But on my mother's side, both Germanic immigrants, one from Ostfriesland, which always evokes a bit of a smile when you tell that to most Germans. And
I know why. Yes.
Yes, you know why.
Well, let's stop here for a moment,
okay,
because we have an international audience, and I don't know who to compare the Ostfriesians to, but there was a time in Germany, and it has calmed down a little bit, where everybody made jokes about the Ostfriesians, but they're great people, brave people who live along the North Sea. So the first part came from Ostfriesland, and the other one?
And the other one were Volgadeutsch. So they came from Russia back through Germany, as far as we can tell, originally from Baden-Württemberg, and certainly from looking at their physical appearance, they would appear so. And then left under Tsar Nicholas II and forced conscription into the Russian army. And so I have kind of that side on my mother's side is an interesting piece to the Germanic audience. And for the English audience, my father's side were Welsh coal miners that emigrated to the U.S. So we had quite a mix in the background there, which I think drives a part of that curiosity that I have. So
did you speak German at home also?
My grandfather did, but of course he spoke the Plattdeutsch, which is that very strange dialect that they have in Northeast Germany.
It's actually an extra language. It's not even a dialect. Yeah, you know that.
Yes.
Sure.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So you grew up in Nebraska, and maybe let's not go through your entire childhood. So you went to high school, probably somewhere, and which was the academic path you choose?
Well, I chose to originally become a Lutheran minister, so evangelical for those in Germany, and ended up studying law instead. So I took the opposite path of Martin Luther, who was studying law and ended up being in the priesthood, ended up taking that opposite path. And that took me to a lot of very interesting places.
That was obviously in the 70s, right?
That would have, yes, the late 70s, correct.
Okay, and then to make that period short, after you graduated from law school, what did you do for the next, I think, 10 years or so?
Yeah, I had the dream job of dream jobs. I worked for a United States federal district judge as a clerk. So this is a position for lawyers, and absolutely fantastic experience. You're kind of behind the scenes in what happens in a federal court, which are the courts of kind of highest reputation in the U.S. From there, went into the practice of law for about 8 years and represented a number of different clients, including having one client in the UK on a very strange patent case. So that was kind of my first inkling that I might get out of the U.S.
Why did you leave this profession? And obviously you went to Switzerland to do an MBA, which is the next phase in your life.
Right.
So what made you choose that path?
The person that had founded the firm that I was last with, unfortunately, passed away at an early age. I think 56 years old from pancreatic cancer. After that, he was a seminal part of that firm. After that, we went into what often happens in small professional practices, that once the leader leaves or departs, in his case, that leadership is gone and the practice begins to disintegrate. that was happening. And the odd story is I was talking to my wife and I said, would you like to go to Europe? And she said, yeah, that would be all right. She went to the hairdresser and was reading a Fortune magazine and actually tore the page out, brought it home and said, look, here's this MBA program in Switzerland. It's ranked #1. Why don't you apply? I did.
What a story.
Yes, I did.
It's good to go to the hairdressers,
yes,
I tell you.
Yes, and read Fortune magazine at the hairdresser instead of People. So I'm not quite sure what she was doing that day. We applied. We came over for an interview to Geneva, where IMD was located at the time before the merger of IMI and Imade. And within a week, I had an acceptance letter from the dean. And from there, it was off to Europe and living in one of the most expensive cities in Europe with no income, which was a glorious year.
I can imagine. Right. So let me think. When was that? When did you do your MBA?
1988-89.
All right. That's an interesting time. Tell me about that time. What did people teach at business schools at that time? Did anybody talk about change management? Mind you, this was the time when Daryl Connor, who actually also was on our show, and our listeners should check that out. It's full of wisdom. So that was a time when Daryl Connor published his first book, Managing at the Speed of Change. So did anybody talk about change management or change at that time at business school?
Well, change was definitely in the air. At that time, it was in the run-up to the Single Market Act that was going to come into play in 1992. And there was a lot of discussion about what was going to happen in the European community as it would evolve, Switzerland not being a part of that, but we were still very tied into that, and many of the students also were from EC countries. So a lot of talk of that, but an interesting conversation consistently on change. It was that corporations were overwhelmed by change. I would say if there was a consistent theme of change in that MBA, that's what we heard all the time. It wasn't that they could cope with change or that they had strategies or that change was a good thing. It's just they were overwhelmed.
What kind of change are you referring to? What were the issues or the problems, the topics companies had to deal with at the time?
Several different types of topics, key changes in technologies, which we certainly heard about from Siemens. At that time, they were in the computer chip business. Stefan Schmidt-Heine would talk about changes in global trading patterns with what is now Holder Bank, but at that time had a different name. And the pharmaceutical companies and Nestle, being two of the stalwart parts of Switzerland, we're talking about changes in kind of how they were able to market internationally.
But that sounds all like macro changes on a macro level. Did people also talk about the micro level, the individual aspects of change at that time?
At that time, we were still very much in what I would call the mechanistic view of change. That change would be another technique you would learn. It would involve good project planning, getting the right people in the team, and getting things done. There wasn't anything about the emotional side of change, anything about the personal side of change.
So what I kept saying in earlier times, change management was nothing more than an extension of project management.
Absolutely.
Right. Yeah. So very quickly then you finished your MBA, and was that the time when you went into the pharmaceutical industry in Switzerland right away?
Actually, before I finished the MBA.
Okay.
The last month of the MBA was a project with a company, and the company I worked with was called Ciba-Geigy, which no longer exists.
Right.
And we were brought in to do a project to look at changing their organizational structure from a global three-dimensional matrix to something else. And given the Swiss, should I say, resistance to change or carefulness or cautiousness or prudence, whatever you call it, that all had to be couched and phrased very indirectly. And we had a lot of good help from the sponsor of the project. So we had to basically fashion the case for change as one of improving cost transparency. Because if we came out right with the idea of change, it probably would have been rejected.
Yeah, and I assume at that time you didn't have many methodologies at hand. You had to come up with something, isn't it?
Yeah, we had to come up with something, certainly nothing like we have now in terms of systems of change and diagnostics and all that. None of that was in
Right.
place.
Exciting times.
Yeah,
I think so. Yeah, cool. And okay, you stayed. Let's make the rest short.
yeah,
You stayed a while. You stayed a while with the pharmaceutical industry,
I did.
and then you. I think that when we met, you still were in Switzerland, weren't you?
I might have been the biggest, probably the most seminal event in my time with Ciba-Geigy and Novartis was the merger to create Novartis, and I was what is called 2IC, second in command, for the merger integration team in the crop protection division, which was an agrochemicals part of the business. And that was a fascinating 18 months. It was 18 hours a day, many days. I sat in an office with McKinsey consultants, and we were in interviews and working very rigorously with different parts of the business, just 6-7 days a week, trying to sort out a very large merger, the largest of its kind to history at that time. There have been larger since, and very complex. Crop protection had subsidiaries in 65 countries, so we had to sort that all out. Plus, put together two very different approaches to R&D.
Okay, and then you went back to the US. You
Correct.
became the dean of the University of the Rockies, as I mentioned at the beginning, and stayed
Right.
there for a while,
Correct.
but not for very long, for a couple of years, I would say, or 4 or 5 years or so.
Well, the typical thing that they say about the dean's positions is it is either something that people do for 30 years or something they do for 3 years. And I was more
Not in
on
German, not in Germany. You
okay.
you do it for the whole life.
For the whole life, yeah. No, in the U.S., the average tenure of a dean is about 3 years, and I
Oh,
definitely met that, and a lot of that is because the faculty rotate in and out of the dean's position.
right. Hmm. And now, finally, I know that you created your own company. You are obviously still teaching, but you're also advising. So, what are you doing nowadays?
We're having a lot of fun. So
That's the most important thing.
yes, yes, and that's why we created the company, and it's interesting. The company, uh, first of all, is an academic services company. We don't call it a consultancy because in our sector, if you say you're a consultant, that's the end of the conversation. So we call it something else, even though it is something different. And it is structured in something I think you would understand in Europe in a very collaborative organization, in the sense that I work with a lot of different people, but we work semi-independently. So I try to avoid having employees, although for some projects I do need to bring some on. And most of the time I'm working with other consultancies, with other independent consultants, putting together a team. The teams often look a lot alike from project to project, but it's just a fun way to work.
Okay, so you don't call it a consulting company, but it's a consulting company.
Correct.
Just
Correct.
off the records. Nobody has listened to that.
None of my clients are listening. That's true, as far as we know.
And you co-authored a book this year, or you told me actually two. I had the chance to read one of them together with three other authors, which has the title Leading Organizations. Wow, this is comprehensive. And actually, I wouldn't have thought that there is still room for a book on that subject, as there have been written so many others on leading organizations. I mean, that's not really new. It goes back to Derek Connor, as I said.
Right.
I like your approach, and I would like to argue about a couple of things which I'm cautious about, but I like it's systematic, and it contains a lot of case studies, so that's really great. It has 37 chapters, and it really covers a lot of ground. So why did you guys feel it's time to write a new book on organizational leadership, and what's your special take on it?
Well, the genesis of it is that I do work with another consulting group or Leadership Institute, and we offer leadership programs quite frequently to different groups. The Chief Executive Institute is one that we offer. And we felt that the leadership literature wasn't suitable to what we were teaching. And it wasn't suitable for a couple of reasons. One is it's either too much of a trade publication. So it's the trend of the year, the month, the 6 months, whatever it is. And we wanted to avoid that. We wanted to be more comprehensive. The other side is it becomes an academic treatise. And we also wanted to avoid that. We wanted to be much more applied and practical. So we built a book which actually looked very different than the one you've seen. And this often happens in editing, as you well know. And that book, we then broke it up into the larger number of chapters with the idea that we would try to address a very different theme of leadership, which is that leadership matters, not whether how you become the perfect leader or what techniques or tools. And by the way, here are some examples that you can look at. Here are some case studies, and here are some thoughts about how this looks. So it's designed to be used in whole, but most likely in part by any organization of interest.
In the book, you or one of your authors, doesn't matter, say we define organizational leadership as the ability to think, act, and influence others in ways that ensure the enduring success of an organization. Okay, I agree with that. I would probably phrase it a little bit different, but I can live with that. Then you say studies suggest fewer than 10% of leaders possess these essential skills. How did you guys come up with this figure? I mean, I'm sure there's no fundamental research on that.
Right. So the first sentence is mine. That one I recognized. The second sentence is Krishna's, and Krishna is would be I believe the second author after Dr. Oda Koban. Krishna is a very interesting individual and author to work with. He's Indian, highly educated, 2 PhDs, successful career in industry. Before setting up and developing into high-ranking 2 business schools in India, he received a genius visa, as we call that, to come to the U.S. and was working there at the time we wrote this book. He's since returned to Bangalore. But he is one of these people that knows everything and has researched everything and probably would be able to give you the place that he took that 10% from.
Okay.
If we were to send him an email within a day, you would have back the citations from where he got it. He's just that brilliant.
In your view, what has changed about leadership, let's say, compared to 20 or 30 years ago? Which are the new requirements or skills for a successful leader beside the definition you gave before?
Part of that, actually, I wrote the introduction, which it's kind of an introductory chapter. And initially we weren't going to have that chapter, but we decided after we had gone through the whole book and put things together that we kind of needed a beginning to set the tone. And how we set the tone in that is very much where we were trying to go with that book, that the difference in leadership is there are multiple differences. The interconnectivity that we see in the world today with all of the technologies, with the increase of people being in different parts of the world, seeing different cultures, and business following along with that or leading it, as the case may be, leads to a world where leadership has to be much more collaborative. And I think there is a theme that threads itself through that first chapter I wrote and then through the whole book. It's that there's a sense of collaboration and skillful collaboration that has to start taking place in leadership for it to be effective in this type of a world.
And it's quite interesting because I'm coming slowly to my, I would say critique, but the points where I would say disappointed, but where I would have expected more. There's the chapter on governance. And then there's a chapter on planning. The chapter of governance mainly addresses the classical, traditional organization. Yes, in one sentence, you also mention new models like holacracy or so, but it's, I would say for me, it sounded quite a bit old-fashioned, but I have to admit, yes, there are many old-fashioned organizations out there, and probably they need help. The second thing is on planning and also on collaboration. You just mentioned new approaches to collaboration. I didn't read anything about the new wave which is flooding all organization, which is the wave of agility. I mean, I saw the word once or twice, but you don't really refer to any kind of agile leadership, any kind of agile method. So the first is the governance. The other one is the agility, defend yourself.
Well, defend the authors together, because there were some collective decisions about both of those. The governance piece, we had a lot of discussion, and you'll see kind of threaded through there things like holacracy, teal organization, sociocracy, perhaps sociocracy. The reason we didn't go further with that is we felt the clientele we have that would read that book is not yet there. And if we go too far out, then we're going to lose them. And they have so many fundamental problems that we cover in that part of the book. Just to get to that level would be a marked improvement for them. So that was kind of a decision we made as a group, the four of us, that we would stay with probably what is older. And we all recognize that, particularly Krishna. He was urging us to do more, and some of us were saying, well, maybe, and then Dr. Otakoven said, but our clients aren't there. They're not ready for this. So a little more traditional on that space. And coming to the second point,
agility.
I think we had a discussion about that, and we felt, and now that I've taught design thinking and seen and updated my teaching on design thinking over these last few weeks, I think we were right in saying it wasn't ripe enough to put into a book that we probably won't revise for 2 or 3 years. In other words, let's leave a short mention of it, leave flexibility in there. It's probably an older type of a concept, if not in terms. And when we come back to a version 2, probably in about 2021, we will definitely be able to deal with agility. We just didn't feel it was ready for prime time yet.
Okay, point taken. Right, good. Looking forward to the next edition. Let's come to our core, which has received more attention only in the last 10 years, which is the topic of space as an aspect of change. One of my personal heroes, Kevin Kelly, the previous editor-in-chief for The Wired, published a seminal book in 1998. I don't know whether you know it. It has the title New Rules for a New Economy. And I do read it again every other year, not every other year, but every couple of years. Just read it again 2 weeks ago because I had a keynote on identity in the 21st century and on space. So he already predicted more than 20 years ago that we are moving from places to spaces. So the old concept of here is business, here is a place, has changed dramatically, of course, because of the internet mainly, but also because of other things. We're going to talk about that. That's, by the way, that's why we choose the concept of space as our theme for the 2019 Berlin Change Days. So let's go bit by bit. How did you start to reflect about this topic of space? Because I remember you talked about it already 2011 at the Berlin Change Days. So how did you get into that topic?
Some of this goes back to my experience with Ciba-Geigy, and I didn't know that Edgar Schein, a very distinguished academic at MIT, had been at Ciba-Geigy about the time I joined and had written about the stifling culture that was reinforced by what he called cultural artifacts of things such as all doors being closed in the hallways, having lights to show whether it was a red light you couldn't enter, it was a green light, it was okay, or it was no light, it might be okay if you knock. And just the way that type of a physical environment reinforced a culture that wasn't open, wasn't collaborative, and was consensus driven, because that's the Swiss. And I felt that very much when I joined Ciba Geigy, and I did something that really shocked some of the people. I left my door open all the time in my office. And I remember my boss asking me, "Do you want me to close the door?" And I said, "No, leave it open." And people would go by and look in like, this is strange. Is this a coffee room or what's this problem? And by the time I had been there about 5 years, about half the doors were open. So there was a change taking place. But that's kind of where I started with this very closed culture where I'd been used to a professional practice, which was very open and flowing and sensible. And at the same time, I was teaching an executive MBA and would teach about culture. And Edgar Hall had this idea of cultural proxemics, about how close you can stand to people, whether you're in their space and those types of things. And that was a very much interesting to me. So that's kind of where it all started. And then what we see if we fast forward, we see change missing something. And I started to notice this during the Novartis merger and then a couple of the Syngenta merger, which I worked on subsequent to that the consultants had this way of coming in and taking over this big conference room and making it into, we don't want to call it a war room, but making it into kind of a situation project room where a lot of work got done. And that was fascinating to me, particularly the work I saw when I worked on the Syngenta merger in the UK, because we had virtually a whole quarter of a building to ourselves, and we had kitted that out, to use a British term, to make that into kind of a project space. And it was very much as you would see a co-working space today. There were reflective areas where you could work. There were tables where we all sat together, and somebody would say, "It's tea time. Why don't you go get the tea right now?" We are in the UK, right? And then there were those areas where, okay, let's go over here and let's map this out and put this process on the wall and kind of create a working space together. They did that almost naturally, which I found absolutely fascinating. And from there, I kind of took that and took the methodologies that we had used for change, which was a combination of systems-based change, so tools, techniques, and David Cooperrider's appreciative inquiry, which was the norm in Ernst & Young, the other part of the organization, and put those two together.
Okay, wait a second. There's a couple of things I need to understand. I mean, first of all, what you described sounds very cool. And of course, nowadays, every company has to have such a cool room, of course, with baby football and so on, but also with this kind of design thinking atmosphere and so on. But then again, I mean, most companies I know haven't really transformed fundamentally. They have such a room. Very often they even outsource this and have, well, there's a lot of these spaces in Berlin, as you know, where Daimler and Lufthansa and I don't know who have their co-working and creative spaces. But if you go into many organizations, which I do regularly as a consultant, okay, doors are open. That has changed. There are some open space offices, and of course the whole issue of open space office is one by itself, but change is slow, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. And it's to a certain extent, it's generational. And I think it may appear in the next 5 years to be very fast, but that will have more to do with the generational change in management than it does with the fact change is already happening.
What's your general concept of space with regards to change? What's your theory about it?
The original idea was that as we design our change methodologies, our change approaches, if you want to call them that, we historically had thought in this mechanistic tool-based idea of people, process, and technology. And so the technology being the lead if you're in certain consultancies, process maybe a close second, and then people need to adapt to the technology and or process. I added place in there because I was starting to see, based on several of the consulting engagements I was at, that place had a substantial impact on whether change occurred in a meaningful way, whether it was sustained, and the pace at which that change could take place. And I did see this a lot with working with corporations in what we call the advanced solutions environment, which we call the Montessori school for the executives. There was a flow we designed in that, and I got to work in 3 of those over time. And so that was the original idea. Now this year, what I'm doing is a little bit more of a deeper dive, and I'm looking at how place and dialogue interact, and that gets more into this collaboration. And dialogue is thought of as a broader concept, not just the verbal word-based dialogue. And so I've got a little bit broader concept for that. So what I'm looking at there is how your physical position, how what you say, how you're told to act actually influences how you perceive change. And this goes back to what we've learned since really about 2009 in the neuroscience area about how we process change as a threat and what that does to our brains and how we overcome that. The order and the precedence of things can completely alter whether we're willing to talk about change or whether we push back against it. And it's not as though there's a master design anywhere of a building, a space, co-working, collaborative space, or whatever, which is going to be perfect. Because the reality is, it's kind of what we make it. Those team rooms I told you about, yeah, they might be cool today in some of those places, but we were in a dumpy basement in a rundown UK corporate headquarters in a building they didn't use anymore. And usually the heat worked, and I only say usually. But one thing that always did work was a tea kettle. And I guess that's a prerequisite in the UK to be able to occupy a building. And it worked just fine because we had decided how we were going to do that. And we just naturally moved to these different types of spaces.
There's a couple of threads again.
Okay.
You just opened new threads, which is fine. And I'm trying to follow the different threads. I want to come back to one thing first, because a little bit earlier in our conversation, you mentioned David Cooper-Ryder and appreciative inquiry. And I learned with Cooper-Ryder in 2000 or so. So I didn't yet get the connection between the work of David Cooper-Ryder and appreciative inquiry and the concept of space. What's your connection with it?
We add one more dot to what we need to put into place there. So what David had discovered was in his doctoral dissertation at Case Western and subsequent work was that if you begin with positive, or he calls it appreciative aspects in a change process, you get better results. That was as complicated as it got in a nutshell. What we now know, and this is connecting that additional dot from brain-based research, is that excites or lights up a different part of the brain than beginning with the problem-based dramatic need for change, which creates a fight or flight threat response in the brain. And chemically, this is the interesting part, and this comes out of a lot of the neuroscience research. Chemically, you basically disable the positive thinking parts of the brain for a period of time with that threat response. So the order in which you do things and the way that you set up place and the way that you manage place can play into that quite substantially.
In which way? For example, give an example.
Sure, several different ways. People need to have a safe place to go for reflection.
Right.
And if that is not available, and that's particularly for certain types of personalities, very, very dramatic, they will be in a threat response. The conversational spaces need to be in a way where people can maintain a reasonable semblance of autonomy, and that they don't really have a threat of their status. So there's some interesting things there that come out of that. And the broader meeting spaces, so now we're getting into the bigger areas. Things like the traditional conference room are an absolute disaster because they quickly shut down people's creativity. They put people behind a table. They usually have someone at the top of the table speaking to them, giving directions and orders and issuing threatening types of messages about the problem we have. And this just all sets off the wrong types of responses. So how you arrange that space, and then this interplay of how you structure what you do, which is essentially the dialogue, is very important.
Okay, I think I'm slowly getting your point. It's quite interesting because you obviously have quite a comprehensive and holistic image and concept of space, which fits very well with this year's Berlin Change Days, because we try to have the same approach. We talk in our introduction, we talk about inner, outer, and cyberspaces. So do you have anything to say about cyberspaces? How does that come in, where people nowadays are separated in time and space? There's a lot of need for virtual collaboration. Do you have an idea on that as well?
I think we're at the beginning of a substantial revolution in that area, driven by probably several advances in the technology, but that's not going to displace person to person. And some of the things that are going to help us use that technology more effectively are that it will be easily available, and the screen resolution, sound resolution, and just the quality of what we see on both sides is going to be markedly better, which gets us closer to the way we're able to read other people in a person to person. There's still some things that we can't yet replicate when you get into brain science about other senses other than hearing and seeing. There's another part of presence, which goes to the base part of the brain, which is your taste, smell, and kind of the sense of what's happening. We're not going to be able to replicate that, I don't think, anytime soon.
I don't think so either. I mean, you know, I'm a big evangelist for virtual collaboration. I've just talked about that 2 weeks ago, and I think we really need to get ready. And I agree with you. We're just at the beginning of the beginning. I mean, it will be a revolution. So I'm totally on your side. However, I believe the human need for direct connection, for physical closeness, I wouldn't never say never, but in the time to come, definitely in my life and probably in the next 50, 60, 100 years, I don't think they will be replaced by machine communication. Don't you think so?
That's exactly my point. And it gets into, depending on how you count the number of senses people have, the traditional thought of senses, there are at least three that are not able to be addressed in a virtual conversation. Sight and sound, so seeing and hearing, yes, can be addressed, will be better than it has been in the past, and would be very inviting, I think, with virtual reality and 3D and some of those things. What we don't address is taste, smell, and there's a certain presence, proximity type of sensing, which is a little bit the pressure on the skin and these types of things like that. Those senses actually go to a different part of the brain. Right. And we are not going to be able to replicate those with anything I've seen in internet and communication technology.
Yeah, and there's probably something beyond the senses even. I'm not quite sure, because on the other side, we know from neurology, of course, all we have are the 5, or some people say 6 or 7, whatsoever senses. It doesn't matter. And these are our only possibilities to connect to the world. And yet I believe there's something which just happens when two people are together in the room. But maybe it's really just a combination of the senses. I don't know.
Well, yeah, I didn't want to go down the road of saying there's a metaphysical sense, but you know, if that were to be the possibility, certainly that would only add to validity to what I'm thinking.
I love that. Doug, if we summarize all that, what you have said, and obviously there is no one size fits all, so any organization needs to find their own way to deal with the issue of space. But what are some hands-on tips that you would give to organizations if they want to revisit their own concept of space? Some very general tips.
I started at a different place than architectural design, and I know this will be difficult for those that are inclined toward physical design and architecture to maybe completely comprehend. But here's how it goes. I start with, in a change effort, what types of dialogues do we need to have? And typically it kind of falls into 3, which is actually very similar to how you've structured change days this year. There's the broader dialogues, which I call concurrence type dialogues, where you bring lots of things, lots of people, lots of ideas together. There are the closer 1-on-2, 1-on-3, 1-on-5 types of things, which are more dialogic and more give and take, so smaller groups. And then there's kind of those dialogues which are increasingly moderated with technology, which are people kind of on their own, and they may be interacting with technology, they may be simply thinking, but I leave that as kind of somewhat of a modified dialogic space. You need to think through what you need to do in your change efforts on all three of those areas. And let me give you the example we had from working with very large numbers of executives in our advanced solutions when we would work through significant strategic and product alignment issues. We found that, yes, there's a need for those big meetings, but not right at the start. You need to start out with kind of working in smaller groups, letting people go off on their own, thinking, discovering, kind of dialoguing, maybe with some aspects of the environment, although you don't want to talk to the plants too much or people will start to wonder what's happening. But really, that was kind of some of the things that we allowed. So we would put interesting books around the room for people to pick up and read. We would put diagrams on the wall, just kind of things like that to help evoke a little bit of this idea of, what are you trying to do? So you think that through, and there's a flow, and it's not linear. It will go back and forth. So you have to be a little bit skilled at what I call change navigation, which is kind of the way I'm starting to describe change management in a new way, is that you have to navigate it. And you have to be able to sense when, yes, now is the right time to get those 5 people together in a dialogic space and work through that issue. Or, you know what, at 2:00 this afternoon, I think we're going to be ready for the bigger meeting. So let's have it. And let's get to that meeting and let's get that together. So, kind of the mechanistic planning of these events is not going to work very well, but having an overall understanding that you're going to move in and out of different types of communication and dialogic spaces or collaboration models, I think is very key. Yeah. Now, you use space as an adjunct to that. So if I have a space, take my example of the dingy basement in the UK former headquarters building. We had a space where we could go and we could put what the Brits call brown papers up on the wall, and we could do all kinds of things with how we were going to redesign organizational issues, organizational processes, and deal with organizational issues. Those are the kind of things that you have to allow. It's a little serendipity, and it doesn't do well for those that really need to have a lot of certainty, but I think it'll get the job done and change.
Yeah, thank you very much. It resonates very much with me, because when I talk about virtual collaboration, I say about the same. I say, think about people's needs and the process needs first. Think about what you want to achieve, and then think about the tool, or think about the architecture, the virtual architecture. And that's basically what you also said. Yeah.
Not as eloquently as you, but I tried.
Doug, I'm so much looking forward to meeting you again in a couple of weeks in Berlin. And I'm particularly grateful to you because you coined the phrase which captures the essence of the Change Days best, which is the Change Days provide a unique in the world forum for the incubation, launch, and refinement of change leadership and management. So thanks very much for giving us this nice summary. And you've talked already a little bit at the beginning about your impression of the Change Days, the Berlin Change Days. We also have now Toronto Change Days, which also happened in November with Brigitte, who you probably know. We did an in-house Change Days at her organization. And we are going to do that more frequently. So is there anything else which you want to say, why you really keep coming back year after year to our event from wherever you live?
Well, first of all, as my catchphrase says, it is really unique. I do attend a fair number of conferences every year, and the Berlin Change Days is unique for not only the reasons that I mentioned, but also it changes, it evolves. And it is, I have never seen one year be too similar to the previous year, but I've always seen every year be an absolute delight in terms of the additional topics, the learnings, the networking that we do. And there are many people that are still around that were there that first time I came in the old co-working spaces, I remember, which was my first launch into something like that.
Yeah, 2010. And, yeah.
Yeah. And, that was just quite the experience. And, it's just every year seems to be organized a bit better, a bit differently, and is always inviting and stimulating.
Thank you so much. And thank you for being a true friend and a fan a true fan, coming back every year. Looking forward to meeting you soon, and looking forward to your workshop you will be giving on space as an element of change. Doug, as I expected, that was a wonderful conversation. We could have continued probably for another hour or two, and we should do that. You're very, very inspiring. So thanks for taking the time, for showing up, and good luck for the last weeks in Vilnius.
Well, thank you very much. And I will look forward to being in Berlin. I will be a little more adjusted. I'm going to be in the Netherlands most of the week before, so I should be through my jet lag and fully awake and ready to go when I get to Berlin.
Wonderful. See you soon. Thanks so much.
Okay, take care. Okay, bye-bye.